November 885, on the river Seine, north of Paris, the water disappears. Not from flood, not from ice, from ships. A Viking fleet so vast that a monk watching from the walls would write that the river vanished beneath the hulls, that a man could no longer see the water for 2 leagues. 700 ships, he claims, and tens of thousands of Northmen aboard them. The largest Viking host ever brought against a single city. They have come to Paris. And Paris, in the year 885, is not the city we know. It is a single fortified island in the middle of the river, the Ile de la Cité, a stone teardrop connected to the riverbanks by 2 bridges, each guarded by a tower. That is all. 2 bridges, 2 towers, and an island. Defending it, roughly 200 fighting men, commanding them, a count named Odo, and an old bishop named Gauzlin, who will fight on the walls himself. For the past 50 years, Vikings have sailed up this river almost as they pleased, sacking Paris 3 times and being paid to leave a 4th. The Frankish emperors have made a habit of buying them off. The Northmen have learned that the greatest empire in Western Europe will always, eventually, pay. This time, the answer is no. And what follows will last almost a year, and end the empire it was fought to save. To understand why the Vikings came in such numbers, you have to understand what had happened to Charlemagne's empire. 70 years after his death, the Frankish realm had been carved up, reunited, and carved again by squabbling heirs. By 885, it was nominally held together by one man, the Emperor Charles, called by later chroniclers Charles the Fat. A ruler who had inherited the whole of Charlemagne's inheritance and almost none of his nerve. His answer to Viking raids had consistently been the same. Negotiate. Pay. Grant land. Move the problem downstream. The Northmen read that answer exactly as you'd expect. The Seine became a highway, and in 885 a coalition of Danish warbands gathered under a leader the sources call Sigfred. A king, the chroniclers note dryly, in name only, because among these men no one truly outranked anyone else, and rode up the river with the intention of stripping the interior of Franche-Comté. Paris was in the way. The island fortress and its 2 bridges sat directly across the Seine, and the bridges were low. Viking ships could not pass beneath them. To reach the rich country upriver, Burgundy, the abbeys, the unravaged heartland, the fleet had to get past Paris. Under it, through it, or over its dead. Sigfred came ashore to negotiate first. He went to Bishop Gauzlin and asked, reasonably enough, for passage. Only passage. His men would not touch the city. He simply wished to sail through, and he pointed out, accurately, that the city could not stop him. Gauzlin's reply is one of the great refusals of the Middle Ages. He told the Viking king that the city had been entrusted to him to guard, not for its own sake, but for the safety of the kingdom behind it. That if his own head were the pledge of these walls, he would give it before he gave the passage. If Sigfred had come as Gauzlin had, sworn to protect this place, then Sigfred would understand why the answer was no. Sigfred understood perfectly. He told the bishop that his siege engines would answer instead. The assault began the next morning, the 25th of November. The Vikings threw everything at the northeast tower guarding the Grand Pont, the great bridge on the right bank, because the tower was still unfinished. Its upper courses were raw and half-built. They came with ballistae, with catapults, with slings, with a storm of arrows. They set up mangonels and hammered the stonework. Every man in Paris who could hold a weapon went up onto that tower, and the bishop went with them. They held, all day, into the dark. And that night, the 200 did something the Vikings did not expect. Instead of sleeping, they built. Through the entire night, by torchlight, under a rain of missiles, the defenders raised an entire new wooden story on top of the damaged tower. When the sun rose, the Northmen looked up at a fortification that was taller than the one they had spent all day breaking. The second day's assault was worse than the first. Vikings crowded the base of the tower with picks and rams, tearing at the foundations. And from above came the defenders' answer. Cauldrons of boiling oil, pitch, and wax poured directly down onto the men below. Abbo of Fleury, a monk who was inside the city and who wrote the eyewitness account of the siege, describes Northmen tearing at their own scalps as the burning mixture ran under their mail. Those who could still run threw themselves into the Seine. The tower held. And Sigfred understood he was not going to storm Paris in an afternoon. So the Vikings did what the Vikings had never had to do in Francia before. They dug in. They built a fortified camp on the right bank, around the Abbey of Saint-Germain. They settled in for a siege, a proper siege, the kind that grinds a defender down over months. Through the winter, they tried everything. They mined beneath the walls. They built 3 enormous covered battering rams and rolled them at the tower. They filled the defensive ditch with earth, with branches, with the carcasses of slaughtered cattle, and, the chronicler insists, with the bodies of prisoners they had killed for the purpose. They floated 3 fire ships downriver into the wooden bridge, hoping to burn it out from under the defenders. The bridge held. The fire ships grounded. The defenders sank them. And through all of it, the number that mattered never changed. 200 men, plus every priest, merchant, and townsman who could carry a stone up a ladder against a host that could rotate fresh warriors into every assault. Then, in February, the river betrayed them. A flood came down the Seine and tore out part of the Petit Pont, the small bridge to the left bank. When the water dropped, the tower guarding that bridge stood alone, cut off from the island, unreachable, unsupportable. 12 men were inside it. The Vikings offered them terms. The 12 refused. The Northmen piled fire against the tower until the garrison was driven out into the open, and there, on the riverbank, all 12 were killed. In a siege of tens of thousands, 12 men chose to die rather than open a gate they no longer had any reason to defend. Spring brought no relief, only death by attrition. Disease moved through the crowded island. In April, Bishop Gauzlin, the man whose refusal had started all of this, died of illness on the walls he had promised to hold. The city's spiritual anchor was gone, and no imperial army had come. So Count Odo did something extraordinary. He left, not to flee, to fetch help. Odo slipped out of Paris with a handful of companions, rode through hostile country to find the Emperor Charles, and demanded that the empire honor its obligation to its own capital. Then he rode back. The Vikings knew he was coming and moved to intercept him at the very gates of the city. Odo cut his way through the Northmen and back onto the island, a moment Abbo describes as electrifying the defenders, who saw their count fighting his way home rather than escaping. By late summer, the Vikings had split. Sigfred himself, having received a modest payment, took part of the force and left. Other bands rode off to raid Le Mans and Chartres, because a year outside one stubborn island was no way to get rich. But a substantial host remained, and Paris was starving. And then, in October, the imperial army finally came. Charles the Fat arrived with a force large enough to end the matter and encamped on the heights of Montmartre, looking down at the Viking siege lines and the battered island beyond. Below him were the men who had held the gate of his empire shut for 11 months, at a cost he had never had to pay. He did not attack. Instead, Charles negotiated. He agreed to pay the Northmen 700 pounds of silver. And, this is the part that Paris would never forgive, he granted them permission to sail up the Seine and spend the winter ravaging Burgundy. Burgundy was a province currently in revolt against him. The emperor, in effect, hired the men who had spent a year trying to butcher his own citizens and pointed them at his own rebellious subjects. The Parisians' reaction is one of the most eloquent things in the whole account. They refused to let the Viking fleet pass beneath their bridges. After everything, they would not personally open the road. The Northmen were forced to haul their ships out of the water and drag them overland around the city, past the walls of the people who had beaten them and who would not lift the gate even when the emperor commanded it. The siege was over. The consequences were only starting. Charles the Fat had done what Frankish rulers always did, and this time, in full view of everyone, at the exact moment it was no longer necessary. The nobility of West Francia had watched 200 men do what an emperor with an army would not. Within a year, Charles was deposed by his own magnates. Within 2, he was dead. And the man they raised in his place was not a Carolingian at all. In 888, the Frankish nobles elected Odo, Count Odo, the man who had held the towers and cut his way back through the Viking lines as king of the Franks. The dynasty of Charlemagne had been set aside in favor of the man who actually defended the realm. Odo's family, the Robertians, would eventually become the Capetians and rule France for centuries. As for the Northmen, some of them stayed on the Seine. A generation later, a Viking leader named Rollo, who later tradition places at this very siege, would be granted land at the mouth of the river in exchange for keeping other raiders out. That grant became Normandy. A century and a half after that, Rollo's descendant would sail to England and be crowned at Westminster. 200 men, 700 ships, 11 months on a stone island in the middle of a river. They held the gate. Their emperor opened it anyway, and the crown went to the men who fought. Thanks for watching Historical Club. If history's greatest last stands belong on your screen, subscribe. Because some sieges outlive the empires they were fought for.